Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, stands motionless as the executioner lifts the first brand from the coals. She is 67 years old, the last of the Plantagenets, the daughter of kings. Her sons have watched through iron bars as the instruments were prepared, the pincers, the heated irons, the tools of royal vengeance. The smell is what assaults them first. Burning flesh mingles with the dampness of stone, with the acrid tang of fear sweat. Margaret does not scream, not when the first brand touches her breast, not when her flesh blackens and splits. The silence is more terrible than any shriek, a silence that speaks of royal blood refusing to bend, even as the body breaks. Her sons cannot look away. They are held there, witnesses to their mother's agony, their faces pressed against the cold bars. One of them vomits, the other weeps silently, his tears catching the torchlight. This is not execution, this is theatre. This is Henry VIII's final lesson to those who dare remember that other kings once ruled England, kings whose blood runs purer than his own. But why? Why would a king who once called her Blessed Margaret order such barbarism against an elderly woman of royal lineage? Why would he force her sons to watch? The answer lies not in what Margaret Pole did, but in what she was. The court of Henry VIII in the year 1520 glittered with a brilliance that masked its dangers. Tapestries woven with gold thread adorned walls of polished oak. The scent of rosewater and ambergris hung heavy in the presence chambers, where courtiers moved like dancers in an elaborate pavan, each step measured, each word weighed for hidden meaning. To breathe the air of Greenwich Palace was to taste ambition and fear in equal measure. Margaret Pole moved through this world as one born to it, because she was. Her blood carried the weight of the Plantagenet dynasty, that ancient line of warrior kings who had ruled England for 3 centuries. Her father was George, Duke of Clarence, brother to 2 kings, Edward IV and Richard III. Her mother, Isabel Neville, had been co-heiress to the greatest fortune in England. Margaret herself had been born in Farleigh Castle, cradled in ermine, nursed by women who curtsied when they entered her presence. But blood could be both shield and sentence. Her own right, a title unprecedented for a woman. He had entrusted her with his most precious treasure, his daughter Mary. Margaret had become the princess's governess, the woman who taught her Latin and French, who held her when nightmares came, who embodied everything Mary's own mother, Catherine of Aragon, wished her daughter to become. In the royal nursery at Richmond Palace, Margaret would sit beside Mary's bed, the firelight casting shadows on the embroidered hangings. The child's hand would grip hers with desperate strength as sleep approached. "Tell me again, Lady Salisbury," Mary would whisper. "Tell me I am legitimate. Tell me I am still a princess." And Margaret would smooth the child's dark hair and lie with a steady voice. "You are the pearl of this kingdom. Nothing can change that." But Margaret knew what the child did not yet understand. The walls were listening, the servants reported every word, and the king's love was as changeable as English weather. The first crack appeared in 1527, when Henry's eye fell upon Anne Boleyn. Margaret watched Anne glide through the privy chambers, her French hood adorned with pearls, her dark eyes promising everything a man might desire. The air around Anne seemed to crackle with dangerous energy, the scent of her perfume exotic, foreign, wrong. Margaret's fingers would tighten on her prayer book during Mass, the leather binding creaking under her grip. She knew what was coming. She had seen it before, in other courts, in other reigns. A king's desire could topple nations. When Henry began proceedings to annul his marriage to Catherine, Margaret's position became impossible. She stood between the king and his obsession. Worse, she stood as a reminder. Her very presence whispered of older claims, truer blood, rightful succession. In the corridors of Hampton Court, conversations would cease when she approached. The rustle of her skirts on the rush-strewn floors became a signal for silence. Courtiers who had once sought her favour now studied the tapestries with sudden fascination as she passed. Her sons felt it too. Henry, Lord Montague, her eldest, came to her chambers one winter evening in 1529. The fire burned low, and frost traced patterns on the diamond-paned windows. He knelt beside her chair, his breath misting in the cold air. "Mother," he whispered, though they were alone. They say the king married Anne Boleyn in secret, swelling with his child. The Pope's authority was cast aside like a soiled glove. England would have its own church, and Henry would be its supreme head. Those who refused to acknowledge this new order would learn the price of conscience. Margaret Pole watched as the world she knew dissolved. Catherine of Aragon was banished to dank manor houses, her title stripped, her daughter declared a bastard. The word itself, bastard, hung in the air of court like a foul miasma. Princess Mary became merely the Lady Mary, her household disbanded, her jewels confiscated. At 17, the girl who had been England's pearl was sent to serve as maid to her infant half-sister Elizabeth. Margaret received the summons to Greenwich Palace on a November morning when fog clung to the Thames like a shroud. The Lord Chancellor's messenger stood in her presence chamber, water dripping from his cloak onto the stone floor. His face was carefully blank as he delivered the king's command. She was to resign her position. She would no longer serve Mary. Her fingers crushed the parchment slowly, the wax seal cracking. "I understand," she said, her voice steady though her heart hammered against her ribs. But she did not understand. She understood nothing except that the trap was closing. She went to Mary in secret, one final time. The girls' rooms at Hatfield were cold and small, a princess's chambers transformed into a servant's quarters. Mary sat by a narrow window, her face gaunt, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles shone white as bone. "They want me to sign it," Mary whispered. "The oath. That my mother's marriage was incestuous. That I am—" Her voice broke on the word she could not speak. Margaret knelt before her, ignoring the protest of her aging joints, and took those trembling hands in her own. The scent of lavender from Mary's gown mingled with the mustiness of neglect. "You will do what you must to survive," Margaret said, and each word cost her. "Your blood is precious. Preserve it, whatever the price." "Even if the price is my soul?" "God sees all hearts. He knows what is forced and what is freely given." But as Margaret left Hatfield for the last time, the November rain soaking through her cloak, she wondered if survival itself might be the greater sin. Worse, a tunic embroidered with the 5 wounds of Christ, that symbol of the failed northern rebellion against Henry's religious changes. Geoffrey broke under interrogation. Not torture, he needed no torture. Fear was sufficient. In a chamber in the Tower of London, with the sound of the Thames lapping against stone walls, he gave them everything. He named his brothers, he named his mother. He wept as he signed his confession, his tears blotting the ink. Margaret learned of his betrayal in her manor at Warblington. The arrest came at dawn when the sky was still grey and uncertain. The king's men rode through her gates with torches blazing, their horses' breath steaming in the cold October air. They gave her no time to dress properly, no dignity of preparation. "Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, you are arrested for high treason." The words seemed to come from very far away. She stood in her chamber in her nightgown, her grey hair loose around her shoulders, the informality itself a violation, a stripping away of rank. Through the window she could see her servants being roughly questioned in the courtyard below. "On what charge?" Her voice emerged cold, controlled, every inch the Plantagenet princess. "Correspondence with traitors, conspiracy against His Majesty's person, denial of the royal supremacy." They searched her home like looters sacking a conquered city. Chests were overturned, their contents, silks and velvets and the accumulated treasures of a lifetime, scattered across floors. They tore tapestries from walls seeking hidden compartments. In her private chapel, they smashed the stained glass, hunting for evidence in the coloured shards. And they found it, or claimed they did. A banner bearing the 5 wounds of Christ. Documents that supposedly proved a conspiracy to place her son Reginald, safe in Rome beyond Henry's reach, upon England's throne. As they led her from her home in chains, Margaret turned for one last look. The manor where she had raised her children, where she had felt briefly safe, stood with its door gaping open like a mouth frozen in a scream. Smoke rose from somewhere within. They were burning papers, destroying records, erasing her existence. Her son Henry, Lord Montague, was already in the tower. They'd taken him a week prior. Her son Geoffrey, the betrayer, was there too, though kept separate, preserved as a penetrated beyond flesh, beyond bone, a cold that seemed to seep into the very soul. Margaret's cell was barely 8 feet square, its stone walls weeping with moisture that froze in crystalline patterns when the temperature plummeted. A narrow slit of window admitted no sunlight, only the grey half-light that made every hour indistinguishable from the next. The straw on the floor was filthy, unchanged for weeks, and it rustled with vermin in the darkness. She was not permitted fire. This was the king's specific instruction. Let the old woman freeze. Let her feel in her body what it meant to defy Tudor authority. Her fingers grew numb, then painful, then numb again. The cold transformed simple movement into agony. At night, she would press herself against the wall where another cellar joined hers, seeking the phantom warmth of human presence on the other side. She did not know who inhabited that adjacent darkness, but sometimes she would tap upon the stone, 3 slow knocks, and occasionally the knocks would return. Someone else was there. Someone else was suffering. In December of 1538, they came for her son Henry. Lord Montague was led to the scaffold on Tower Hill while frost glittered on the grass. Margaret was not permitted to see him die, but she heard the crowd's roar, that peculiar sound a mob makes when a head falls. It echoed across the tower grounds, and she knew. She pressed her fist against her mouth to keep from screaming, because the guards were listening, always listening, and she would not give them the satisfaction. The body was brought past her window, covered in canvas, on its way to burial. A trail of blood drops marked its passage across the frozen ground. They executed 12 others that winter, cousins, nephews, allies. The Plantagenet line was being systematically extinguished, pruned like a dangerous tree. Each execution was reported to her, each death described in careful detail by guards who watched her face for reaction. But Margaret had learned long ago to make her face a mask of stone. The trial, when it finally came in May of 1539, was an obscenity masquerading as justice. Margaret was not permitted to attend. She was attainted by Act of Parliament, convicted without being heard, sentenced without trial. The evidence against her? A banner found in her home. Letters her son Geoffrey claimed she had written. The test lesson written in pain and terror. The torture began in the spring of 1540. Not the rack. She was too old, too frail. Her bones would simply break and death would come too quickly. No. This required imagination. This required creativity, worthy of a king who styled himself the supreme head of church and state. They brought her sons first, Geoffrey and Arthur, who had been kept alive precisely for this purpose. They were chained to the wall of an adjacent chamber where they could see through an open door but could not intervene. Geoffrey sobbed before it even began. Arthur stood rigid, his face a mask of horror. The braziers had been heating for hours. The irons glowed red, then orange, then that peculiar white that speaks of heat beyond bearing. The smell of hot metal mingled with the dampness of stone, with the sharp scent of fear. Margaret was stripped to her chemise, the final humiliation for a woman of royal blood. Her arms were bound behind her, forcing her body forward, exposing her chest. She was 67 years old, and her body bore the marks of age, the sag of breast, the looseness of skin, the vulnerability of flesh that has lived too long. The executioner approached with the first iron. His face was covered, but his hands shook slightly. Even he, accustomed to death in all its forms, found this task monstrous. "In the name of the king," he said, his voice muffled behind cloth, "for the crime of high treason." The iron touched her breast. The sound Margaret made was not quite a scream, more a sharp exhalation of breath, forced out by pain too enormous for voice. The smell of burning flesh filled the chamber instantly, acrid and sweet and terrible. Her son's cries echoed off stone walls, Arthur roaring in impotent rage, Geoffrey weeping, begging them to stop. The iron was applied again, and again. Each breast burned in turn, the flesh blackening and splitting. Blood and fluid seeped from the wounds, hissing where it struck hot metal. Margaret did not beg. She did not plead for mercy. Between applications of the iron, she raised her head and looked directly at her sons. Her eyes, those Plantagenet eyes, grey as winter sky, held a message they would carry to their graves. Remember who you are. Remember what they have done. Rations. In her delirium, she spoke to ghosts. To her father, drowned in wine, to her brother, beheaded for his blood. To Catherine of Aragon, dead of a broken heart. To Mary, her beloved Mary, now restored to the succession, but forever marked by what she had witnessed and endured. I kept faith, Margaret whispered to the darkness. I kept faith. On the morning of May 27th, 1541, they came for her one final time. The execution order had been signed. Margaret could barely walk. They had to support her as they led her to the private execution ground within the tower walls. This death would not be public. There would be no crowd, no witnesses beyond the necessary functionaries. Henry VIII wanted this particular crime forgotten as quickly as committed. The executioner who waited was young, inexperienced. The regular headsman had refused this duty. Even he had limits. This boy had likely never beheaded anyone before. His hands shook as he gripped the axe. There was no proper block, merely a low section of wood. Margaret was forced to kneel, to place her head upon this inadequate surface. The morning was cold and mist rose from the ground, wrapping around the small party like a shroud. I have committed no treason, Margaret said clearly, her voice carrying despite her weakness. I die a faithful daughter of the Church and a loyal subject of the rightful king. The rightful king. Even now, even at the point of death, she could not help but make the distinction. The young executioner raised the axe. It fell badly, striking her shoulder instead of her neck. Margaret jerked, crying out. He struck again, and again, hacking at her like a woodsman felling a stubborn tree. 11 blows it took, some said more, before her head finally separated from her body. Blood pooled on the ground, steaming in the cold air. The executioner stood, panting, splattered with gore, the axe hanging from his trembling hands. He had butchered the last of the Plantagenets, and the memory of it would haunt him until his own death years later. They buried Margaret in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the tower walls, in an unmarked grave. No monument, no memorial. Henry VIII ordered that her name be struck from official records wherever possible. She was to be erased, forgotten, a cautionary tale whispered in corners but never spoken aloud. Her conspiracy to overthrow the king, correspondence with traitors, denial of the royal supremacy. The evidence. A banner, some letters, the testimony of frightened men who would say anything to save themselves. But evidence can be manufactured, treason can be invented, and Henry VIII had never needed substantial proof to destroy those who threatened him. Perhaps the true crime was simpler, more primal. Margaret Pole had better blood than Henry Tudor. Her lineage stretched back through unbroken centuries of Plantagenet kings, warrior monarchs who had conquered nations, who had ruled by ancient right rather than battlefield fortune. Henry's claim rested on his grandfather's victory at Bosworth, a single day's violence that had overturned the natural order. Every time Henry looked at Margaret, every time he saw her move through his court with that unconscious pride of birth, he was reminded of his own inadequacy. The Tudors were upstarts, barely 2 generations removed from Welsh obscurity, and Margaret's very existence whispered a dangerous truth. There were others with older claims, truer rights. Or perhaps it was about Mary, the daughter Henry had declared a bastard, the child Margaret had raised and loved. As long as Margaret lived, Mary had an anchor, someone who remembered when she had been a princess, who treated her as royalty despite her father's decrees. To truly break Mary, to truly force her submission, Henry needed to destroy the woman who had given her strength. Or perhaps, and this is the darkest possibility, there was no reason beyond cruelty itself. By 1540, Henry VIII had become a monster. The golden youth had transformed into a diseased tyrant whose leg ulcers wept pus and whose paranoia saw traitors in every shadow. He had beheaded 2 wives, dissolved the monasteries, executed counsellors and friends with casual brutality. Perhaps Margaret's torture and death was simply what happened when absolute power encountered absolute corruption. The truth remains locked in the past, buried with Margaret in her unmarked grave. We know what was done. We can measure the horror in the testimony of those who witnessed it, in the records that survive despite Henry's attempts at erasure. But we cannot know why, not truly, not completely. What we can know is this: Margaret Pole died as she had lived, with courage that transcended her frail body, monstrous for even history to fully comprehend. The question echoes across the centuries. Was Margaret Pole dangerous because of what she did, or because of what she represented? Was her torture meant to punish treason, or to erase memory itself? The answer died with Henry VIII, taking the truth to whatever judgment awaits tyrants. What remains is only the horror, and the enduring mystery of why one king needed to inflict such suffering upon one old woman, whose only crime may have been carrying in her veins the blood of older, better kings.